In a New York courtroom years after her last great runway, Linda Evangelista does something she has spent most of her life avoiding. She puts the damage on the record. The model who once refused to get out of bed for less than $10,000 a day now sits under fluorescent lights while lawyers read out medical terms for what happened to her neck, her thighs, her back. Paradoxical adipose hyperplasia, permanent disfigurement, severe emotional distress. The woman who helped invent the idea of the supermodel has to explain in legal language why she stopped leaving her house. On the other side of the case is not a jealous rival or a vindictive editor, but a company that promised to make beautiful women marginally closer to an impossible standard. A company whose advertisements ran in the very magazines that once lived on her face, for the culture that made her. A culture that tells women their bodies are both their only currency and their own responsibility. The lawsuit is an embarrassment. For Linda, it is the first time she refuses to disappear quietly, when the system that turned your image into a global commodity damages that image beyond repair. What does justice even look like? And who gets to decide how much a face is worth? By the time she sits under those fluorescent lights, Linda has already lived through every dream and nightmare the beauty industry can sell. She has been the girl no one wanted to book, the woman every designer fought over, the face of the 1990s, the punchline about $10,000 a day, the ghost that fashion stopped mentioning. Now she is something stranger. A former supermodel asking a judge to put a price on what was done to her body. Long before courtrooms and legal terms, there was a kid in St. Catharines, Ontario, staring at magazine pages taped to a bedroom wall. Linda Evangelista did not stumble into modeling the way the industry likes to mythologize, discovered at a mall or plucked from obscurity by fate. She hunted it. She studied the poses, the angles, the way light wrapped around cheekbones. She watched an ant put on lipstick before going out and understood with a seriousness unusual in a child that glamour was a kind of armor. At school, she was not the popular girl, not the prom queen in waiting. She was the one sketching dresses in the margins of her notebooks, the one who stayed up too late watching beauty pageants on television. Not for the crowns, but for the gowns. Her bedroom became a private shrine to women she had never met, glossy faces torn from the pages of Vogue, pinned in straight lines and imperfect grids, watching her back as she practiced a walk that made sense only to her. Her first jobs were not glamorous. Bridal catalogs for $8 an hour. Local ads where no one knew how to pronounce her last name. Fluorescent-lit studios in strip malls where the dresses were too big and the shoes too small. She saved every small paycheck, not for clothes or parties, but for test shoots. Grainy black and white pictures she believed might be her ticket out. When an agency in New York finally said yes, she went. When they said go to Paris, she went there too, alone with a suitcase, a portfolio, and the kind of stubbornness that comes from knowing no one else is going to build the life you want for you. Paris at first did not want her. She was not tall enough, not generic enough, not whatever the casting directors had circled that season. Open calls meant standing in lines that curled down staircases and onto sidewalks, only to walk into a room, turn once, smile, and hear, "Merci, au revoir." The work she got was forgettable. Catalogs, lookbooks, the occasional small show where the clothes were more hopeful than good. Sometimes the paycheck did not cover the rent on the shared apartment she lived in with other girls chasing the same mirage. Then came the request that would define an early fault line in her relationship with the industry. A demand that she pose nude in a way she had not agreed to. The promise had been tasteful, discreet. The reality felt more like pressure than art. She walked away. The agency dropped her. In the economy of fashion, saying no can be more dangerous than any runway fall. For Linda, it was the first of many times she discovered that protecting yourself and protecting your career are often mutually exclusive. She went home, back to Canada, back to the bedroom where the magazine pages were now curling at the edges. For a while, she tried to imagine a different life, university, an office job, something reliable. But she had seen enough of the world beyond St. Catharines to know that if she stayed, the regret would calcify. So she did what she would do again and again. She went back. Back to Europe, back to rejection, back to small jobs and open calls. It took years, not months. Years of being almost right. Years of working every day but never on the jobs that defined a career. I wasn't an overnight success, she would say later. I went through a lot to get where I was. That slow climb mattered. It meant that when fashion finally turned its full attention on her, she knew exactly how hard it had been to earn. The turning point came with a pair of scissors. In Milan, her agent and a hairstylist convinced her to cut her hair into a short, sharp crop. It was not a trim. It was an amputation of an identity the industry thought it understood. The immediate fallout was brutal. Of the roughly 20 shows she had been booked for, 15 dropped her. The girl with the long commercial hair had been a safe choice. The girl with the boyish crop was a risk. For a few weeks, it felt like a catastrophe. She would walk into castings and see the flicker of confusion, then dismissal, on the faces of casting directors. Some were blunt. "What have you done?" Others were polite in the way that hurts more. "We'll keep you in mind for next season." But then, as the collections rolled on, something shifted. Editors started talking. Designers started looking again. The haircut did not just suit Linda. It transformed her. Suddenly, the face that had seemed merely pretty became architecture. The crop revealed a jawline, a neck, a skull shape that looked engineered for light. The proportions of her features, the wide-set eyes, the full mouth, the strong nose, snapped into a new alignment. Girls in the audience started bringing photos of her to salons. This was the Linda effect. The moment the model stopped following trends and started dictating them. What turned that haircut into a myth, though, was not the hair itself, but the collaboration it ignited. In New York, photographer Stephen Meisel saw her and understood immediately that she was not just another model. She was an instrument. In his studio, under his lights, she discovered she could be someone different in every frame. A silent film star in one shot, a 1960s socialite in the next, then an androgynous alien who looked like she had stepped out of a sketchbook. "It is easy to work with a photographer once," she would later say. "Anyone can be a novelty. To be booked by the same eye over and over again, you have to offer more than bone structure. You have to bring ideas. Together they built images that defined a decade. The now classic black and white portraits where she wears a simple white shirt and looks at the camera with an expression that is somehow both blank and deeply knowing. The elaborate editorial stories where she inhabits characters more fully than many actors do. A bored aristocrat, a 1940s film noir heroine, a futuristic warrior. Their work did not just sell clothes, it sold a fantasy of what fashion, and a fashion image, could be. By the early 1990s, Linda was not just in the background of fashion. She was the lens through which the world saw it. Versace runways became moving altars, and she, alongside Naomi Campbell, Christy Turlington, Cindy Crawford, and Claudia Schiffer, were the high priestesses. They walked in tight formation, a living front row of power. When the music hit and they stepped out together, audiences screamed the way they once had for rock bands. George Michael's Freedom 90 video, with the supermodels lip-syncing in his place, crystallized the shift. The era of the designer or the singer as the only star was over. The models were the icons now. Linda, with her shape-shifting face and chameleon body, was at the center of that storm. You did not just see clothes and then, incidentally, the woman wearing them. You saw Linda, and the clothes were lucky to be along for the ride. Off the runway, she understood the economy of her image better than anyone. The infamous line, "We don't wake up for less than $10,000 a day," was delivered half as a joke, half as a boundary, tossed off in an interview with the casual arrogance the era demanded. The industry heard greed and entitlement. What it really was a woman who had built herself from catalogs and rejection letters announcing that her time cost money. In a business that had always expected pretty girls to be grateful, it was revolutionary to insist on being expensive. Her superpower was transformation. Brunette one season, platinum the next, redhead the season after that. A bowl cut, a bob, a pixie, a wave of curls. She could look European or Latin or almost alien, depending on the lighting. She did not just wear clothes, she made them make sense. Designers talk about how a collection came alive when she walked in a look. Fashion magazines stopped using her as a supporting player and started building issues around her face. But behind the mythology of the supermodel was a simpler, uglier reality. The entire system was built on making women's bodies into product, and then judging those bodies as if they were the women's personal moral failures. Weight gain was laziness. Wrinkles were negligence. Aging was a kind of betrayal. The cruel jokes about models being over at 30 were not jokes, they were policy. Linda's private life did not exist in a separate universe. Her marriage to elite models boss Gerald Marie situated her inside the same power structures that controlled her career. It meant living with the man whose agency booked her work, whose clients decided who mattered this season and who did not. Later, her relationship with French businessman François-Henri Pinault and the birth of her son put her under a different, more tabloid kind of scrutiny. Photographers lurked outside schools and restaurants, deciding day by day which version of her to sell. The glamorous icon or the aging woman who dared to become a mother. She was disciplined. The workouts, the diets, the no-alcohol stretches before important shoots. But as the years passed and new faces appeared, younger, fresher, built for a digital age, she found herself straddling a strange line. She was legendary, an adjective people reserve for those safely in the past, while still being young enough to work if the phone rang. Nostalgia began to wrap around her name like tissue paper around an object someone is about to put on a shelf. By the time she reached her late 40s, the industry that had once raced to keep up with her reinventions had quietly moved on. A new generation of models had arrived, monetized through Instagram and reality television, selling not mystery but access. Linda, who had ruled an era when rarity was the point, found herself in an economy where overexposure was the business model. Designers still loved her. Editors still spoke of her with awe. But the bookings slowed. The phone rang less. In that gap between who she had been and who the industry now wanted, something dangerous slid in. The suggestion that perhaps a small procedure, a non-invasive tweak, might help. Not to make her into someone else, just to keep her fresh. It is the kind of language women hear constantly past a certain age, especially women whose careers have been built literally on their faces. Do nothing, and you are accused of letting yourself go. Do something, and you are expected never to admit it. In 2015, Linda agreed to undergo cool sculpting treatments, a fat-freezing procedure marketed as safe, easy, lunchtime cosmetic science. The promise was seductively modest. A little less volume here, a tighter line there. No surgery, no scars, no downtime. The sort of thing an industry veteran might do quietly and then pretend was the result of genetics and Pilates. The clinic was bright, softly scented, decorated with before and after photos whose befores already looked better than most people's afters. A technician marked lines on her skin with a pen, explaining that the machine would target stubborn pockets of fat. The words were clinical, the tone reassuring. This was not vanity, she was told. It was maintenance, the professional equivalent of updating a wardrobe. What happened instead has a name so technical it almost sounds harmless: paradoxical adipose hyperplasia. In plain language, the fat cells in the treated areas did not shrink. They did the opposite. They multiplied. They hardened. They grew into solid bulges that stuck out against the rest of her body. It is a rare side effect, the brochures assured patients. Rare is not the same as impossible. The changes were not abstract. One morning, Linda noticed that the space where her jawline used to be had become a shelf. The area under her chin pushed forward instead of pulling back. The outer edges of her thighs developed firm, unmoving pads that no amount of diet or exercise seemed to touch. When she tried to put her arms flat against her torso, they bumped against new growths. Clothes that had once skimmed now caught. She began to choose outfits not because she loved them, but because they hid. She went back to the doctors. She had not one but multiple corrective procedures, including full-body liposuction performed under general anesthesia. Each time she hoped it would undo the damage. Each time she woke up in a hospital gown, skin mottled with bruises, drains taped to her sides, and the bulges remained. The medical reports called it disfigurement. Linda called it the end of the career she had spent decades building. The physical damage was only part of the story. In interviews later, she would say the cool sculpting treatment sent her into a cycle of deep depression. Try to imagine what that means when your face and body have been your livelihood, your art form, your passport. Try to imagine walking past a mirror and seeing not the person you used to know how to present to the world, but a stranger stamped with the failure of a fix you chose. There is a particular cruelty in being punished not for vanity, but for obedience to a culture that told you maintenance was a duty. Days blurred. She stopped answering the phone unless she had to. Invitations to events, the kind that once structured her calendar, went unanswered. Publicists learned to say, "She's taking some time for herself," a phrase that sounded gentle and neutral and did nothing to describe the hollowing out of her days. Her son noticed before she found the words to explain it. "Mom, do you remember when you used to be fun? Why don't you smile anymore?" he asked. Linda did not have an answer she was ready to say out loud. How do you tell your child that you let someone freeze part of your body because you were afraid of disappearing, and the result made you disappear in a different way? So she did what a lot of wounded animals do. She hid. She stopped going to fashion events. She declined invitations that would put her in front of cameras. She avoided restaurants where she might be recognized. She did not just withdraw from the industry. She withdrew from her own reflection. The bathroom mirror became something to navigate around, not look into. She learned where in the house the light was most forgiving, and gravitated toward those corners the way she had once gravitated toward the best spot on a runway. On magazine covers, nostalgia for the supermodel era bloomed. Naomi and Cindy walked new runways, starred in campaigns, fronted documentaries about the golden age. Designers reissued archival looks Linda had once worn without calling her to wear them again. The woman who had taught the world to cut their hair like hers was now watching from a couch in sweatpants, making sure the blinds were closed. Silence hardened around her. The industry did not ask what had happened. It simply behaved as if she had chosen to leave. Fans speculated online. Maybe she had retired, maybe she was sick, maybe she was simply done. The truth was more specific and more painful. She felt so altered, so betrayed by her own body that the idea of stepping back into a space built entirely on image felt impossible. In 2021, after nearly 6 years of trying to fix, minimize, or simply endure, Linda did something she had spent a career avoiding. She made the damage public. She filed a lawsuit against Zeltic Aesthetics, the company behind Cool Sculpting, seeking tens of millions of dollars in damages. The legal complaint used phrases that, on paper, would sound clinical if they were not attached to a human being. Paradoxical adipose hyperplasia, permanent disfigurement, severe emotional distress. It cataloged the parts of her body the way fashion once did, except now the list was a ledger of harm. In a sworn statement, she described herself as brutally disfigured. The words landed with a shock because they came from a woman whose face had once been considered a global standard. Even people who knew nothing about fat-freezing procedures knew Linda Evangelista. To hear her say publicly that a beauty treatment had ruined her career and shattered her mental health cracked the smooth surface the industry worked so hard to maintain. The industry was rattled. Cosmetic procedures are one of its worst-kept secrets, the invisible maintenance underpinning the illusion that beauty can defy time without assistance. To hear one of its most famous faces say, openly, that she had been harmed by a supposedly routine treatment threatened the entire narrative. Brands issued careful statements. Some colleagues sent private messages of support. Publicly, fashion largely remained quiet, hoping the story would pass. Linda did not let it. In 2022, she appeared on the cover of British Vogue, the first major fashion image of her since the procedures. It was not an act of denial. It was an act of curation. Makeup and lighting softened what they could. Scarves and high collars framed what she did not yet want the world to scrutinize. At one point during the shoot, tape and elastic were used to adjust the skin along her jaw for the camera. An old on-set trick suddenly laden with new meaning. The resulting photographs were beautiful, but the beauty was no longer the glossy, untouchable kind. It was threaded with knowledge. This is a woman who has paid for these images in ways we do not like to talk about. In the accompanying interview, she spoke plainly. She missed her work. She missed the runway, the collaborations, the adrenaline of the shows. She did not pretend otherwise. But she also said she could not simply step back into the industry not with what I look like now. It was a sentence that landed like a punch. Not because it revealed vanity, but because it revealed how deeply the logic of acceptable appearance had been stitched into her sense of possibility. As if one bodily catastrophe were not enough, Linda was also fighting something the Cool Sculpting pamphlets had never mentioned: cancer. In 2018, she was diagnosed with breast cancer and underwent a lumpectomy. She thought she had outrun it. 4 years later, the disease returned. This time, the treatment was brutal and final. A double mastectomy, chemotherapy, the whole architecture of her upper body rewritten in hospital light. While the world was arguing about whether her Cool Sculpting lawsuit was justified, she was lying on an operating table signing consent forms that weighed more than any contract she had ever negotiated. In the pre-op room, wearing a thin gown with a pattern of forgettable blue flowers. She listened as a surgeon calmly explained risks and percentages. She had spent a lifetime being measured in fractions: hip, waist, bust. And now the numbers attached to her body were odds and survival rates. The antiseptic smell, the beep of monitors, the pen marks on her chest where incisions would go. All of it belonged to a world far from the backstage chaos of a fashion show. And yet the stakes felt oddly similar. Once again, her body was a site of work, except this time the work was staying alive. She told almost no one. The circle that knew was tiny. Among the people who kept calling, who did not accept silence as an answer, was Christy Turlington, her fellow supermodel and longtime friend. In an era when celebrity friendships are often performances for social media, Christy's loyalty was almost old-fashioned. Regular check-ins, quiet visits, showing up without fanfare. Linda credited her with being one of the threads that kept her from coming apart completely. Recovery was slow. There is nothing glamorous about surgical drains, about learning how to lift your arms again, about staring at scars that redraw the map of your own body. For someone whose chest and shoulders had once been photographed from every angle, the new reality required a different kind of courage. The courage to look, to touch, to accept. When she was finally well enough to work again, Linda did not return to the runway. She returned to something more intimate, the studio, with Stephen Meisel making a book that would gather decades of their work together. It was, on the surface, a coffee table retrospective. At a deeper level, it was an act of reclamation. By choosing which images to include, which eras to emphasize, which faces of herself to present, she was asserting that, after a lifetime of being curated by others, she had a say in her own archive. In the press around the book, she was asked what it meant to see all those old pictures again. The young, fierce, almost impossibly symmetrical Linda looking back at her. She answered with something that was not quite nostalgia and not quite regret. She said she was trying to love herself again, not the 25-year-old in the Versace dress, the 60-ish woman with surgical scars and uneven contours who had survived things far more dangerous than a bad haircut. Work trickled back in, cautiously, then more steadily. A Fendi campaign marking the anniversary of the baguette bag. A documentary about the supermodels where she sat alongside the women who had once shared runways and cover stories with her. In those images, you can see traces of the old Linda, the way she knows exactly how to turn her head to meet the light. But there is something new as well, a refusal to pretend that time and trauma have not left their marks. The lawsuit eventually settled. The terms were confidential. There was no televised verdict announcing what the court believed her face and body were worth. There rarely is in stories like this. What lingered was not the legal outcome, but the fact that she had dared to demand one at all, to stand up in a system that had always preferred its damaged women to go away quietly and make that system look at what it had done. Today, when she appears, in a Fendi campaign, in a documentary, in a candid shot with other supermodels, people are quick to call it a comeback. The word implies a return to a previous state, as if the goal were to pretend nothing had happened. But Linda does not look like nothing has happened, and she does not talk like a woman intent on erasing the past. There is a steadiness to her now, a gravity under the familiar cheekbones. She lets the camera see as much as she is willing to share and no more. The fashion world, always hungry for new narratives, has tried to turn her into one more inspirational story. The woman who overcame, who got real about cosmetic procedures, who taught us all a lesson about self-acceptance. There is truth in that, but it is a partial truth. It leaves out the years in the dark, the terror of watching her body change without her consent, the financial blow of work lost, the sleepless nights wondering whether her son would have to grow up without her because of a disease no one can blame on vanity. What then is the legacy of Linda Evangelista? It would be easy to say it is the images, the runway struts, the covers, the campaigns that still circulate on mood boards and Instagram feeds 3 decades later. It would be easy to say it is the cheekbones, the haircut, the line about $10,000 a day. But perhaps the more unsettling, more honest answer is this. Her legacy is the crack she has forced in the illusion that beauty, especially female beauty, can be endlessly optimized without cost. For every woman who has looked at a mirror and thought, if I just fix this one thing, Linda's story is a caution and a kind of comfort. Caution, because even the most minor tweak carries risks that brochures gloss over. Comfort, because when the worst happened, she did not vanish forever. She stepped back into the light on her own terms, scarred and altered and still undeniably herself. In the archives, the photographs of her in the 1990s will always exist. The supermodel at the height of her power, defining an era. In the courtroom transcripts, there is now a different record. A woman itemizing what was done to her in the name of improvement. Between those two sets of documents lies the truth about what a culture like ours does to the women it raises onto pedestals and then leaves alone with the consequences. So when we look at Linda Evangelista now, not the poster in a teenage bedroom, but the woman who walked into a courtroom and asked the world to acknowledge her as harmed, not ruined, not washed up, but harmed. The question is not just what happened to her. The question is what her story says about the rest of us. If a face that once sold the world on perfection can stand up and say, "This broke me and I am still here," what excuse do we have for insisting that beauty must always look effortless? And when a culture builds its fantasies on the bodies of real women, then shrugs when those bodies pay the price, who should really be on trial?